So there we were. Three supposedly intelligent life forms standing in the smoking wreckage of what used to be a perfectly good diplomatic transport, staring at a sky that looked like it was planning something nasty. And by nasty I mean the kind of weather that makes hurricanes look like a gentle spring breeze. My name's Jake Martinez, and I'm what you might generously call the human representative on this little interspecies goodwill mission. Though right now, standing knee-deep in alien ship parts scattered across a planet that definitely wasn't in the travel brochures, I was feeling less like a diplomat and more like the guy who gets to explain to three different species insurance companies why their premium transport was now modern art. Captain Vorthak, our Zentorian military escort, stood about 8 feet tall with skin that looked like someone had crossed a rhinoceros with a disco ball. He was currently striking what I can only describe as a heroic pose while surveying the crash site, because apparently even catastrophic ship failures couldn't dampen his sense of dramatic flair. "Fear not, primitive human," Vorthak announced in that booming voice that all Zentorians seemed to think made them sound impressive. "This minor setback shall not impede our mission. The resilient physiology of the Zentorian warrior caste renders us impervious to the minor inconveniences of planetary exposure." Right, minor inconveniences. I glanced up at the churning mass of clouds that was building on the horizon like nature's own freight train, then back at Captain Dramatic over there. Our third wheel was Quillex, a Blopian scientist who looked like someone had given a jellyfish a PhD in anxiety issues. They were currently vibrating at a frequency that suggested either deep scientific contemplation or the early stages of a complete nervous breakdown. The atmospheric pressure readings are most concerning. Quillex warbled, their translucent body pulsing with nervous bioluminescence. The storm system approaching exhibits characteristics consistent with a Class 7 meteorological event. The probability of survival without adequate shelter approaches statistical insignificance. "See," I said, pointing at our resident weather nerd. "That's science talk for we're all going to die horribly if we don't find somewhere to hide." Vorthak waved a dismissive hand that could have doubled as a small shovel. Zentorian warriors have endured far worse than mere weather. During the siege of Krelnoth, I personally withstood 17 cycles of plasma bombardment while maintaining combat effectiveness. "That's great, Captain. Really impressive," I said, trying to keep the sarcasm to a minimum. "But unless you can punch clouds into submission, we might want to consider the radical concept of not standing out in the open when the sky decides to have a temper tantrum." The wreckage around us told a pretty clear story. Our ship had come in too hot, clipped what looked like the planetary equivalent of a mountain, and distributed itself across about half a mile of rocky terrain. The good news was that we'd all survived with nothing worse than bruises and wounded pride. The bad news was that our shelter consisted of whatever we could salvage from parts that were no longer ship-shaped. I started doing what humans do best in crisis situations, taking inventory of our resources while everyone else argued about whose fault everything was. We had emergency rations for maybe a week, a functioning water reclamator that was currently making concerning grinding noises, and enough scattered hull plating to maybe build something that might charitably be called shelter if you squinted at it in poor lighting. The storm front was getting closer, and I could already feel the temperature dropping. This wasn't going to be one of those gentle rain showers that make you think about cozy fireplaces. This was going to be the kind of weather event that makes you appreciate the evolutionary advantages of living in caves. "Look," I said, gesturing toward the twisted hull plating scattered around us like the universe's worst jigsaw puzzle. "We've got maybe 3 hours before that storm hits. I can use these panels to build us a basic shelter framework, seal it with that foam insulation from the bulkheads, and at least give us something between us and whatever fresh hell this planet's weather system has in store." Vorthak let out what I can only describe as a scoff, if scoffs could shatter glass and intimidate small planets. "Shelter. Human. Your species' obsession with hiding from the elements is precisely why you have remained confined to a single star system for so long. True warriors face adversity head-on, not cowering behind makeshift barriers like frightened younglings." "Right. Because standing in the rain like an idiot is definitely a sign of advanced evolution," I muttered, already mentally cataloging which pieces of debris would work best for structural support. Quillex pulsed a nervous yellow-green. "While I appreciate the philosophical implications of Captain Vorthak's position, the meteorological data suggests that direct exposure to this storm system would result in what humans colloquially term becoming very dead very quickly." "Exactly," I said, pointing at our jellyfish friend. "Thank you, Quillex. Someone around here believes in the radical concept of not wanting to die." But Vorthak was already striking another pose, this one apparently meant to demonstrate his complete immunity to things like physics and common sense. "The Zentorian respiratory system can filter atmospheric contaminants with 97% efficiency. Our dermis provides natural insulation against temperature variations of up to 40 degrees Kelvin. and our muscular density allows us to maintain core body temperature through voluntary thermogenesis. That's fantastic, Captain. Really, your people are basically biological heaters with built-in air filters. But unless your voluntary thermogenesis can also deflect flying debris traveling at 200 kilometers per hour, you might want to reconsider the whole standing defiantly in the storm strategy. The wind was already picking up, sending smaller pieces of wreckage skittering across the rocky ground like metallic tumbleweeds. I could smell ozone in the air, that particular scent that says lightning is about to start treating the landscape like its personal punching bag. Furthermore, Vorthak continued, apparently immune to things like mounting evidence and basic survival instincts, constructing primitive shelters is an admission of biological inadequacy. It demonstrates that humans require artificial assistance to survive in environments that superior species can endure through natural adaptation. You know what else demonstrates biological inadequacy? I asked, kneeling down to examine a particularly promising piece of hull plating. Being dead is pretty inadequate. Evolutionarily speaking. Quillex was now cycling through colors like a very anxious mood ring. The atmospheric pressure has dropped another 14% in the last 17 minutes. The storm's leading edge appears to be accelerating beyond initial projections. See, I said, standing up with a section of plating that would make an excellent roof panel. Science agrees with me. Science wants us to not die horribly. I'm going to go with science on this one. But Vorthak just crossed his arms, which on a Centaurian looked like two small trees having a disagreement. Let the storm come. It will find the sons of Centaurus ready to meet it with honor and strength. Great motto, I said, already dragging hull sections toward a natural windbreak formed by some local rock formations. I'll make sure they put that on your memorial marker. So while Captain Invincible and Dr. Anxiety settled in to wait for nature to prove them either right or very, very wrong, I did what humans have been doing since we figured out that caves were better than standing around getting rained on. I started building stuff. First step was location scouting. The crash had conveniently distributed our ship across a landscape that looked like someone had been playing cosmic billiards with boulders. About 50 meters from the main wreckage I found a natural alcove formed by 3 large rock formations that would give me shelter from the prevailing wind and a solid foundation to work with. The hull plating was actually perfect for this kind of emergency construction. These diplomatic ships are built to withstand micrometeorite impacts and cosmic radiation, so the panels were lightweight but incredibly durable. I started with the largest intact section, a curved piece about 3 meters long that had probably been part of the ship's outer hull. Using a piece of twisted support strut as a lever, I managed to wedge one end into a crack in the rock face and prop the other end against the opposite wall. What is the human doing? I heard Vorthak ask Quillex in that stage whisper that Centaurians apparently thought was quiet. It appears to be engaging in what their species terms engineering. Quillex replied, pulsing a curious blue-green. Fascinating. Observe how it manipulates the available materials to create structural integrity where none existed before. Primitive tool use, Vorthak dismissed. A crutch for biological inadequacy. I ignored them and kept working. The second panel was trickier. A smaller rectangular piece that had been part of an interior bulkhead. I needed to create a slanted roof that would shed water rather than collect it. Basic physics, really, but apparently advanced enough to qualify as primitive tool use in certain circles. The real trick was the joining. Ship hull panels aren't designed to be assembled by hand in field conditions, but every diplomatic vessel carries emergency repair foam for hull breaches. I'd salvaged 3 canisters from the wreckage, and while it wasn't exactly construction adhesive, it would expand to fill gaps and harden into a weather-resistant seal. As I worked, the wind kept picking up. What had started as a gentle breeze was now strong enough to make conversation difficult and sent loose debris dancing across the landscape. The temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees in the past hour, and I could see the first wisps of what looked suspiciously like hail forming in the approaching cloud wall. Jake, Quillex called out, their voice carrying a note of genuine concern. The barometric pressure indicates the storm will arrive approximately 47 minutes ahead of initial projections. Thanks for the update. I called back, not looking up from where I was sealing the joint between my roof panels. How are our friends doing with their voluntary thermogenesis? I glanced over to see Vorthak still standing in his heroic pose, though I noticed he'd moved slightly closer to a large boulder that would provide some wind protection. Not that he was seeking shelter, of course. That would be admitting biological inadequacy. The third panel gave me my back wall, and I was starting to have something that might charitably be called a structure. It wasn't going to win any architectural awards, but it had 4 walls, a slanted roof, and most importantly, it was significantly more weather-resistant than standing around looking stoic. For the floor I used a section of deck plating that had separated intact from the crew quarters. It took some creative leverage work with another support strut to get it positioned properly, but once I had it in place and sealed around the edges, I actually had a dry level surface to work with. The real finishing touch was insulation. The ship's environmental systems had used a high-tech thermal foam for temperature regulation, and several containers of the stuff had survived the crash. I carefully applied it to the inside surfaces of my shelter, creating an additional barrier against heat loss and sound dampening. By the time I was putting the final touches on my weather seal, the wind was howling across the landscape with enough force to make even Vorthak's heroic stance look a bit less steady. The first fat drops of rain were starting to fall, each one hitting the ground with the kind of authority that suggested this was just the warm-up act. "Behold," Vorthak announced, apparently addressing the approaching storm directly, "I stand ready to face your fury with the strength of my ancestors and the courage of—" A particularly strong gust of wind chose that moment to knock him sideways into Quillex, who immediately began flashing alarm colors like a biological emergency beacon. I stuck my head out of my newly completed shelter and cupped my hands around my mouth. "Hey, Captain. There's room in here if you want to continue your heroic speech somewhere with a roof." "Never," Vorthak called back, though I noticed he was now bracing himself against that convenient boulder. "The storm shall break against Centaurian resolve like waves against an unmoving cliff." "Suit yourself," I said, ducking back inside just as the real rain started to fall. For about 30 seconds, I thought maybe Vorthak was going to be right. The rain started as just heavy drops, the kind you get in a normal thunderstorm. Nothing a supposedly superior alien physiology couldn't handle. I was almost starting to feel a little silly about my emergency construction project. Then the sky opened up like someone had torn a hole in the universe's water tank. The sound hit first. What had been the gentle patter of raindrops became a roar so loud I could feel it in my chest. It was like standing next to a waterfall. If waterfalls could also throw rocks at you and occasionally try to pick you up and relocate you to a different zip code. From inside my shelter, I could hear the wind ramping up from strong breeze to angry God having a tantrum. The hull panels I'd used for walls were actually vibrating from the pressure changes, but the emergency foam was holding everything together. Score 1 for human engineering and appropriated alien technology. I pressed my face to the small gap I'd left as a window and tried to see what was happening to my companions. The rain was coming down so hard it was like looking through a gray-white curtain, but I could make out two shapes huddled against the boulder that Vorthak had definitely not been using for shelter. "Jake," I heard Quillex's voice, barely audible over the storm's fury. "The meteorological conditions have exceeded all predictive models. This appears to be what humans would classify as very bad indeed." Through the wall of water, I could see Vorthak trying to maintain his heroic stance, but physics was having other ideas. Physics was having other ideas. Meteorological conditions have exceeded all predictive models. A gust of wind that must have been pushing 80 kilometers per hour caught him mid-pose and sent him stumbling backward into the rock face. His disco ball skin, which had looked so impressive in normal conditions, was now just providing more surface area for the rain to attack. That's when the hail started. I'd seen hail before. Nice little ice cubes that bounce off your car and make interesting sounds on the roof. This wasn't that kind of hail. This was the kind of hail that makes you wonder if the planet is actively trying to kill you, because apparently regular rain wasn't getting the job done fast enough. The ice chunks were easily the size of golf balls, and they were falling with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for meteors. Each impact on my shelter's roof sounded like someone dropping bowling balls from a great height, but the curved hull plating was designed to deflect space debris, so it was handling the bombardment like a champ. Outside, things were going considerably less well for the representatives of superior alien evolution. "Vorthak," I shouted, sticking my head out into what felt like nature's personal assault rifle. Maybe this would be a good time to reconsider that whole facing adversity head-on philosophy. I could see him now, pressed flat against the boulder with Quillex wrapped around his legs like a very large, very panicked piece of seaweed. His voluntary thermogenesis was apparently no match for ice balls traveling at terminal velocity, because he was shivering hard enough to register on seismic equipment. "The storm," he yelled back, though I could barely hear him over the chaos. "It is more substantial than anticipated." "You think?" I called back. "There's room in here for both of you, just saying." But even as I made the offer, I could see they were in trouble. The boulder they were sheltering behind was providing some protection from the wind, but the hail was bouncing off the rocks and hitting them from weird angles. Quillex had gone from anxiety colors to what I was pretty sure were pain colors, flashing bright red every time a chunk of ice found its mark. That's when the lightning decided to join the party. The first bolt hit somewhere behind us, close enough that I felt the electromagnetic pulse in my teeth. The thunder that followed wasn't the rolling rumble you get from distant storms, it was the kind of sharp crack that tells you the lightning is taking a personal interest in your immediate vicinity. Through the chaos, I watched Vorthak make what was probably the hardest decision of his military career. His pride was telling him to stand firm against the elements like a proper Zentarian warrior. His nervous system was telling him that pride doesn't conduct electricity any better than common sense does. The second lightning strike made the decision for him. It hit close enough to illuminate the entire landscape in stark white detail, and in that moment of perfect clarity, I could see exactly how thoroughly the storm was winning this particular battle. Quillex, Vorthak shouted, his voice cracking with something that might have been desperation. Tactical reassessment. The human's position offers superior defensive advantages. Translation. Help. We're drowning and being pelted by ice while standing next to natural lightning rods. Jake. Quillex's voice was pure panic now. We accept your offer of primitive shelter. Immediately, before we become what humans term very dead very quickly. I scrambled to the entrance of my little fortress, fighting against the wind to keep the makeshift door open as two very wet, very humbled aliens stumbled through the storm toward the safety of human engineering. Getting two alien refugees into a shelter designed for one human turned out to be like trying to stuff a rhinoceros and a nervous jellyfish into a phone booth. Vorthak had to duck almost in half to fit through the entrance, and his bulk took up about 60% of my available floor space. Quillex just sort of flowed in after him, immediately spreading out across whatever surfaces weren't occupied by Zentarian dignity. For a moment we all just sat there in the sudden quiet, listening to the storm rage outside while water dripped off my unexpected guests. The contrast was pretty dramatic. Inside the shelter we had breathable air, reasonable temperature, and most importantly, a distinct lack of ice balls trying to commit assault and battery on our various body parts. So, I said, breaking the awkward silence, how's that superior alien physiology working out for you guys? Vorthak was doing his best to maintain some shred of military bearing, but it's hard to look dignified when you're soaking wet, covered in small bruises from hail impacts, and folded up like a very large, very damp accordion. His disco ball skin had dulled considerably, and he was still shivering despite his voluntary thermogenesis. The storm, he began, then paused to consider his words carefully, exhibits characteristics that were not adequately represented in our initial tactical assessment. Uh-huh, I said, and what characteristics would those be? It appears to be attempting to kill us, Quillex offered helpfully, their bioluminescence still flickering between worried yellow and embarrassed purple, most vigorously. Right. And how exactly does one's biological superiority factor into not being murdered by weather? Vorthak shifted uncomfortably, which in the confined space meant everyone shifted uncomfortably. Perhaps, he said slowly, the Zentarian approach to environmental challenges requires refinement. Refinement, I repeated. That's one way to put it. Outside, a particularly violent gust of wind hit the shelter, and I felt a moment of satisfaction as my hull panel construction held firm. The emergency foam had created perfect seals, and the thermal insulation was keeping us comfortable while the temperature outside had apparently decided to audition for the role of hostile alien planet trying to freeze everyone to death. Jake. Quillex said, their voice carrying a note of what might have been awe, your construction exhibits remarkable structural integrity for something assembled from salvaged materials using primitive techniques. Primitive techniques, I said, right. You mean like thinking ahead, using available resources effectively, and not standing around waiting for the weather to kill me. When you phrase it in such terms, Vorthak admitted grudgingly, your approach demonstrates certain tactical advantages that the Zentarian military doctrine may have overlooked. I was starting to enjoy this. Such as not being dead, he said, with the air of someone making a profound philosophical discovery. That's when I noticed they were both staring at something behind me. I turned around to see what had caught their attention, and realized they were looking at my water collection system. While building the shelter, I'd rigged a simple gutter along the roofline that channeled rainwater into one of the ship's emergency containers. It was basic engineering, really, but apparently it qualified as advanced alien technology from their perspective. You have created a water reclamation system, Quillex observed, their colors shifting to what I was learning indicated scientific fascination. From debris, while under time pressure, without blueprints or computational assistance. It's called a rain gutter, I said. Humans invented them about 4,000 years ago, right around the time we figured out that standing in the rain was stupid. Vorthak was examining the thermal insulation I'd applied to the walls, running one massive finger along the sealed edges. This insulation, it maintains internal temperature while providing sound dampening and moisture resistance. Yeah, that's generally what insulation does. But how did you know to apply it in this configuration? What computational models did you use to determine optimal placement? I stared at him. I put it where it seemed like it would keep the cold out. It's not exactly rocket science, Captain. But the efficiency, Quillex added, is remarkable. The internal temperature is 14 degrees warmer than external conditions, with 96% humidity control and significant noise reduction. This represents highly sophisticated environmental engineering. Or, I said, it represents paying attention in basic physics class and having a functioning sense of self-preservation. But hey, call it sophisticated if it makes you feel better about hiding in my primitive human shelter. The storm was showing no signs of letting up. If anything, it seemed to be getting worse, with occasional impacts that suggested the hail had upgraded from golf balls to bowling balls. Through the small observation port I'd built into one wall, I could see debris flying past at speeds that would make a highway look tame. Jake, Vorthak said finally, his voice carrying a note I'd never heard from a Zentarian before. It took me a moment to recognize it as genuine humility. I believe I owe you what humans term an apology. Oh? Your species' approach to survival challenges demonstrates wisdom that Zentarian doctrine has failed to acknowledge. This shelter represents not primitive construction, but advanced adaptive engineering. And Quillex added, pulsing a respectful blue-green, your foresight in recognizing the danger and taking immediate action may have preserved all our lives. The statistical probability of surviving this storm without adequate shelter approaches 0.003%. I felt a warm glow of satisfaction that had nothing to do with the thermal insulation. So what you're saying is sometimes the primitive human approach of build a shelter before the scary weather kills you actually works. It works, Vorthak admitted, exceptionally well. The storm raged on outside, but inside our little bubble of human engineering, we were warm, dry, and alive. Which, as far as I was concerned, made this the most successful diplomatic mission in the history of interspecies relations. The storm finally broke just after what my internal chronometer suggested was dawn, though with the cloud cover it was hard to tell the difference. The howling wind gradually faded to a gentle breeze. The artillery barrage of hail stopped trying to demolish everything in sight, and the lightning moved on to terrorize some other part of the planet. When I cautiously opened the shelter door and stepped outside, the landscape looked like it had been redesigned by a committee of very angry meteorologists. Debris was scattered everywhere, the crash site had been rearranged into entirely new patterns, and there were impact craters from hailstones that looked like someone had been playing cosmic golf with ice cubes the size of small mammals. Well, I said, surveying the destruction, I think it's safe to say that would have killed us. Vorthak emerged from the shelter, having to unfold himself in stages like some kind of enormous origami project. He stood up to his full height, looked around at the devastation, and then looked back at the small structure that had kept us alive through the night. Jake, he said solemnly, I formally request instruction in human survival methodologies. Come again, your species possesses tactical knowledge that Zentarian military doctrine has overlooked. I wish to learn these techniques. I was about to make a sarcastic comment about superior alien physiology when I noticed something that made me stop and stare. While we'd been weathering the storm in comfort, I'd apparently been busier than I'd realized. The water collection system hadn't just been gathering drinking water, it had been storing a significant reserve. The thermal management had been so efficient that we'd actually generated excess heat, which I'd vented through a simple chimney system that had kept the air fresh and prevented condensation. But that wasn't the impressive part. The impressive part was what I'd done with the excess hull plating. Jake? Quillex said, their colors shifting to amazed orange. When exactly did you construct the additional facilities? I looked where they were pointing, and realized that in my rush to build the main shelter, I'd unconsciously been setting up what amounted to a complete survival camp. There was a food preparation area, under a lean-to, made from deck plating. A water filtration system that used the ship's air scrubbers, and some creative plumbing. A tool storage area, where I'd organized all the useful salvage from the crash. Even a basic sanitation facility, that would have made a Boy Scout troop leader weep with pride. I guess I was just keeping busy. I said, though honestly I was a little surprised myself. Apparently when humans get into survival mode, we really commit to the whole thing. Keeping busy, Vorthak repeated, walking over to examine the food prep area. You created a complete base camp infrastructure while under extreme time pressure, using only salvaged materials and no computational assistance. And Quillex added, pulsing rapid calculations in bioluminescent blue, the efficiency ratios are extraordinary. Water reclamation at 94%, thermal management at optimal levels, food storage with proper preservation protocols, and waste management that prevents contamination of local resources. They were both staring at me like I'd just performed magic, which was starting to make me uncomfortable. Look, it's really not that complicated. You just think about what you need to stay alive, and then figure out how to make it work with what you've got. But that, Vorthak said slowly, is exactly what military engineering is supposed to accomplish. Yet Zentaurian doctrine focuses on enduring hardship rather than eliminating it. Because, I said, enduring hardship is stupid if you can avoid it. Why suffer when you can build something that makes suffering unnecessary? Quillex was now examining the water filtration system with the kind of attention usually reserved for religious artifacts. The integration of multiple ship systems into a cohesive survival infrastructure represents highly advanced systems thinking. How did you learn to perform such complex resource optimization? I grew up on a farm, I said. When stuff breaks, you fix it. When you need something, you build it. When the weather turns nasty, you get inside something sturdy and wait it out. It's not exactly advanced alien technology. Perhaps, Vorthak said, that is precisely why it is so effective. Zentaurian military doctrine assumes that warriors should overcome challenges through biological superiority and force of will. Human doctrine appears to assume that challenges should be overcome through intelligence and preparation. Well, yeah, why would you want to do things the hard way if there's an easier way that works better? They looked at each other, then back at me, then back at each other. I was starting to get the feeling that I'd just blown their minds with concepts that seemed completely obvious to me. Jake, Quillex said finally, I believe we have significantly underestimated human tactical capabilities. And Vorthak added, I formally request that you assume command of our survival operations until rescue arrives. I looked around at my accidental base camp, then at two aliens who had gone from dismissing human intelligence to asking me for survival lessons, then back at the storm-battered landscape that we'd not only survived but actually thrived in. You know what? I said. I think this diplomatic mission is going better than anyone expected. As if to punctuate the moment, my water collection system chose that exact time to overflow, providing us with fresh drinking water and a gentle reminder that sometimes the most primitive solution is also the most effective one. Now, I said, who wants to learn how to build a signal beacon out of ship parts and local minerals? Because standing around waiting for rescue is almost as stupid as standing around in storms. And that's how two supposedly superior alien species learned that sometimes the best way to survive is to think like a human, plan ahead, and never underestimate the tactical advantages of a good roof over your head.